Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Snapshot webinar. My name is ICLEI Lynch from Ironbark Sustainability. We have quite a few presenters to share our expertise today. Imogen Judd from BZE, Bernie Cotter from ICLEI Oceania, Tracy Armstrong from the Climate Council City Power Partnership, Paul Brown, Rachel Armstead, Matt Sullivan and Hannah Snape are also on the line from Ironbark Sustainability. We won't all talk though. Before I get started and hand straight over to Tracy, I'm just going to cover up on some really quick housekeeping issues because for some people this might be your first webinar. First, note that only presenters can be heard through the presentation. You can ask questions whenever you like. Type them into your GoToWebinar question box. We'll try and answer them as we go along. If we don't have time throughout today, we will follow up with Q&A in the next few days, so there are no unanswered questions. Please try and be as specific and clear as possible in your questions, and if you're pointing it to someone, please mention who you are asking. The webinar has also been recorded and will be available for distribution and viewing after today. I am now going to hand straight over to Tracy to introduce today.
Thank you, Lex. So first of all, I wanted to welcome our councils who are part of the Cities Power Partnership to this webinar. And for those who aren't, I'll do a very, very brief rundown of who we are just so that you're not confused. So the Cities Power Partnership is an initiative, a local government initiative of the Climate Council. We currently work with 115 local government areas around the country on emissions reduction. So we are growing and it's wonderful, and so anybody who might be interested in taking part can let me know afterwards or just contact us through our website. So basically the City Power Partnership works in 4 different ways to encourage local government to act on emissions reduction. We do that via profiling local government in the media. We have a big media reach to tell the good news stories of all the wonderful things that you're doing. We connect you with other local governments working in the space to share projects, share knowledge. We have a knowledge hub, a forum, a webinar series of which this is a component, and basically encouraging everybody to do what they can as the level of government closest to the people. It falls on your shoulders and we're very aware of that. So we're here to help. It's a free program. And that's all I'm going to say on that because we have so much to get through today.
Thank you very much. Tracy, Bernie Cotter from ICLEI, welcome.
Thanks, Lex. So I'll just talk a little bit about the Global Covenant of Mayors and the connection with Snapshot. So again, welcome if there's any Global Covenant of Mayors councils on the line. It's an international global program. You can see on the board there's about 10,000 member cities committed to making local contributions to meet the Paris targets, either with some help through their national governments or independently. Mayors and cities around the world have really got a voice now. Subnational government is really the place to be in terms of negotiating change and acting on change. So GCOM, or Global Covenant of Mayors, provides standards for measurement. And that's where Snapshot meets standards in emissions, but GCOM actually looks at adaptation and mitigation, looks at a performance approach where councils will try and develop a strategic approach to community action, and they'll do that by disclosing through reporting platforms. And that disclosure is then something that can be looked at year on year against others. It can look at providing comparisons. It can certainly look at different types of cities and where they might have some similarities. GCOM, I suppose, works on 3 levels simultaneously. One's about measurement and disclosure, one's about building partnerships, and the other one is about the role of advocacy, as I said before. So just through reporting for GCOM, then it's on community-based emissions, it's on risks and hazards, it's looking at the targets and then developing comprehensive action plans and hopefully implementing those. That's the money shot. Okay, ICLEI itself coordinates the international local government contributions through the UNFCCC process. So we manage the city networks and what their message might be there. And GCOM provides the international benchmark for cities and contributions, particularly in this area, in the area of climate. Very much as a finishing off then, we really support Snapshot because we think it provides or removes some of those potential barriers to participation and really moves us along very quickly to action where we really need to be. But you need this sort of information first, either for your own use, for your community's use, or for sharing nationally or internationally.
Thanks, Bernie. And you don't have to copy down all those links because we will send the PowerPoints afterwards and any follow-up information. Over to Imogen from Beyond Zero Emissions. Oh, no.
Sorry.
Just make sure I'm not putting up all my bank account details there. And yep.
Got it.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, that's my kids. You are not that young anymore. Let's try one more time.
All right, so I'll just give a quick introduction to Beyond Zero Emissions. We're a volunteer-led climate change solutions think tank. We've been operating for about 10 years and compile research and community engagement and advocacy on all sectors of emissions in Australia. And we've laid out pathways to zero emissions in the energy sector, in land use, in transport, buildings, and also at the community level. So probably the first of those was the Repowering Port Augusta report, which really took what was possible in a small community facing a really serious energy transition and showing that they had a real economic advantage by embracing renewables, and a big community campaign formed after the release of that report. We've also reviewed all Australian local governments for their climate targets, climate policies, climate information, and we formed the Zero Carbon Communities program, which supports communities to engage to reduce emissions, to set targets and find the best course of action. So the Zero Carbon Communities, so Port Augusta was really kind of the first example of that, and then Zero Emissions Byron formed in 2015. And then in 2016 and 17, we produced the Zero Carbon Communities Guide and supported 3 communities in Victoria quite intensely to develop their community baseline profiles, to develop transition strategies, and to do lots of community engagement. We now have about 38 registered Zero Carbon Communities nationally. And this year, we've also produced the Northern Territory 10 gigawatt report, which showed how the whole of Northern Territory has an amazing capacity to become an exporter of renewable energy to Southeast Asia. And next week, we're launching a report for Collie in Western Australia, which is a coal mining town that provides most of the coal for Western Australia. So we're showing what alternatives are available for that town as well. We also have a program that works with investors to show how they can best support investment flowing through to communities for emissions reductions programs. And we've developed Snapshot in collaboration with Ironbark Sustainability and others. And this is a really great starting point for communities. So just to give a sense of how it got developed. So when I started working with Zero Carbon Communities, we were developing these reports and helping Byron, Baw, Benalla and Nillumbik figure out what their baseline emissions were. And our experience found that it was really time consuming. It was confusing to understand if you were doing the process correctly. It was very technical. It often distracted people from what they were best at, which is generally community engagement and building up what projects are actually most viable in the communities. And for most communities to do it, it would be quite costly. So we were scratching our heads around this because it's a very useful product, but how on earth could we possibly make it accessible for more than 500 communities around Australia? So to help figure that out, I formed a volunteer group of people who had an interest in working out baselines. And one of those volunteers introduced us to Ironbark, and we had a chat with them and about the concept of potentially coding up snapshots so that you could get them automatically. And they thought it was a possible idea, so we started chatting about it, and then we were really fortunate to get some funding, a small grant from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund, and then Sustainability Victoria also came on board with a bit of funding to help us get the ball rolling. So the product now exists. It's not perfect by any means, and it probably never will be, but it is an amazing tool to get a sense of what your emissions are in your community. And I believe it has probably saved council staff and community members hundreds of hours in every single community around Australia. So, you know, you can click a button and get your data rather than spending months and months and months trying to figure out how to get there. So the next phase we'll talk about a little bit more later on, but I might just go back to that, Lex, because there'll probably be questions around this stuff later. So our first intention is to update Snapshot so it's accessible for all councils around Australia. It's still not there for every council. We want to promote it to communities and help communities use it as a tool to engage with their councils if their councils aren't already thinking about this stuff. It's a great tool to improve data literacy, and we can also, over time, improve the data quality. We believe it's a world first in providing this information at a community level for municipalities nationally, and importantly, it's also for all sectors of emissions. And I don't think there's anything else in the world like that. It'd be great to integrate this tool and the zero carbon programs with other projects going on, like the Cities Power Partnership and Global Covenant of Mayors. Ideally, we'd be able to update this annually and also potentially go backwards so you can get an emissions profile over time. And most importantly, use it as a tool to build community capacity, their efficacy and empowerment nationally, so communities can really start the ball rolling and get emissions down. So just a really big thank you to all of the project partners. Beyond Zero Emissions and Ironbark have worked really well on this project, and we couldn't have done it without the support of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Sustainability Victoria, and Vinny.
Awesome, thank you very much, Imogen, and we will touch on those next phases. Over to me. I'm going to go through in a bit more detail the history of how emissions profiles have been developed, what's under the bonnet, the guts of how these profiles are developed and what they mean. Jump into a few of the snapshots, reports, and then how you get the most out of them. Keep your questions coming, the Q&A, you get that question box there, you can jump in and do it. An uber quick introduction. This is Ironbark. We work with councils around Australia on emission reduction and sustainability projects. But I'm going to push forward. We don't need this. This is really informal and casual today. So please do jump in with your questions. This is also a space where we can disagree because we all have a lot of knowledge and different backgrounds, and it's totally okay to do that. Generally, the Venn diagram of agreement is quite close, but there are some areas where we might have different approaches, and that's fine. And just a reminder, it's being recorded. This is who is here. We had about 83 respondents, which was phenomenal. So thank you to all of you. We've got a nice cross-section of councils from around Australia, majority from Vic. The majority are local government. We do have a fair few from the broader community, which is not just residential community programs, but that also includes consultants and a couple of businesses. And we asked for your questions in advance, and here's what they were. If yours isn't up there, it's because you only responded in the last 24 hours, but I've grouped them according to the kind of things that people were after, and a lot was around data, a little bit around action, and then some other stuff. So apologies to those who wanted just to sort of focus on action, not going through the intricacies of the tool. We will go through the intricacies of the tool in a little bit of detail at the start because that did come through in a lot of the questions, but we will get on to how to use it in big picture, I promise you. And if we get a lot of questions and follow-ups after this, we will hold a lot more. There's no dramas there. And those that want specific things like information about cruise ship pollution, we might have to hold that to another day. Okay, way back in 2006, The world mourned the loss of this guy, kind of celebrated the loss of this guy. This guy was our Prime Minister, and this guy was the President of the United States. Some things have changed and some have not. Also, we had a situation where 240 councils in Australia had community emissions profiles. 84% of the population. Your name is probably there. You had an emissions profile. It was all done through the city's four climate protection programs, CCP, as opposed to CPP, the City Power Partnerships. Thanks for that confusion, Climate Council. Then, in 2008 or 9, funding was cut, and there was no more funding for those profiles. Ironically, when this guy became Prime Minister, he cut a lot of the ancillary programs because that carbon pollution reduction scheme was going to solve everything. So programs like Cities for Climate Protection were no more. In the ensuing 10 years, working with councils, as us around the table still do, things changed. Most councils did not and do not have a community inventory. The aforementioned survey that Imogen mentioned, we asked 120 odd councils around Australia and community groups, and the majority said, no, we no longer do have an idea about our community emissions. And this contrasts sharply to what happens in the corporate side of things, your own organisational council emissions. A lot easier, you have control over it, where most do have an understanding and a corporate inventory. Fast forward to 2015 and the Paris Climate Conference. The international program that Bernie mentioned at the start, the Global Covenant of Mayors, was previously called the Compact of Mayors, and it was a really great way to push forward international and local action. Port Phillip, Joondalup and Mornington Peninsula fast-tracked their compliance of this international program, and they required a community emissions profile. A few others, Melbourne, Sydney, Byron, working with a lot of other stakeholders, did the same, but suddenly community profiles were sort of back on the agenda. So the Global Covenant, BZE, as Imogen mentioned, did a lot of great work with community groups to develop community profiles. We had a major bit of work, C40 sponsored and worked with the City of Melbourne to develop a Greater Melbourne profile with 32 cities. The New South Wales Government, now called DPI, but when they were the OEH, supported 30 odd councils developing profiles. There's workshops and groups of councils working together. Sydney has a similar process working with Kinesis and C40. And what we've got is profiles everywhere and a lot more literacy within certain local government sectors on how these things work. There's webinars up there. SV, who co-funded Snapshot, have got a bunch of webinars explaining how community profiles work and what they are. And the C40 and the City of Melbourne sponsored project with ICLEI also incorporated a bunch of resources that are all there, and they're currently still online. If you jump onto one of the websites that we'll send afterwards, there's a lot of background info there. So today, there's over 100 odd councils, communities, that have emissions profiles that have been verified independently by international bodies. Which is interesting because when we asked you at the start of this webinar, have you ever developed an emissions profile at your council, the majority said no or not sure, but in actual fact you probably do have one or have had one in the past. Here's how you do it. There's this thing called the GPC protocol, horrifically named the Global Protocol for Communities Governing Health. Basically, it's like an accounting standard. It tells you how to measure your emissions for the community. This is what sits beneath all of the development of Snapshot, all the work that BZE have done over the last 5 or 6 years with communities, Ironbark, with all of those councils and those international bodies. The beauty of this is it's a protocol or a standard where everyone's on the same page. It's like ENGAs for businesses and councils for their corporate emissions. Everyone got together and said, we need a standard so we're not double counting across municipal boundaries. We want to make sure we've got some consistency. Quite straightforward, a basic emissions profile. You look at your stationary energy, your transport and your waste. And there's about 85 to 90% of your standard community emissions profile. There is also another component that looks at the extra industrial product use and processes and ag, forestry and land use. which covers about 15%. A little more challenging, so you always start with basic. If you want to download the GPC protocol, you can, and you'll see pretty horrible information like this that tells you exactly how to measure the different emissions from different areas. So if you're a car going in and out of one municipality, who claims what proportion of which, how does it work, 180 pages of standard explaining how you do it. Waste, how much of your waste is in your community or another community, all lies beneath Snapshot. All these horrible equations. Some people out there who are data lovers, including a certain Matt Sullivan from Ironbark, will be upset that I said horrible, but I look at these and I freak out a little bit. But basically, this is the stuff that underpins the protocol and underpins the development behind the snapshots. You can jump on and download that if you want, and you can become an expert and learn how to do it. You can do courses as well to understand more about how these profiles have been developed. That 180-page document is generally also very good for insomnia. Luckily, we have had a bunch of experts reviewing, developing, and producing Snapshot and the profiles, including one, Matt Sullivan, who was actually involved in the development of the protocol itself. So he's like one of the accountants, if you like, to develop the document. So we've kind of done it for you. There is one important part of this protocol that I want to mention, and it's the principles around how you report. You'll see you need data that is relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and accuracy. And this is a real mind shift that's happened in the sector quite recently. And one thing to note is that the standard, the protocol, very clearly has these in order. What that means is the most important thing is to have relevant and complete information, then consistency, so you can report over time with the same data sets, transparency. We're not talking about private organisations here, we're talking about councils. Your data, your calculations need to be public and transparent. The last one is accuracy. Accuracy is important, but the protocol, the rules very clearly state that the other four come first. This is why we call community greenhouse emissions profiles. Because by their very nature, there's a bunch of stuff there that we have to model. For your inventory, for corporate, you can actually gather everything together. You've got the billing data, you've got the fleet data, you know where your emissions are coming from. So it's an inventory. We used to call community inventories back when we had those 240 councils. And it leads us down a path where our expectations are not met. So rethinking these, snapshots, emissions profiles in general, everything that underpins them. They're not inventories, baselines, and they're going to change. And this has always been the case. When you're working with community data, there's no such thing as a community inventory in Australia. And having been involved in the development of those 240, 15, 20 years ago, there never has been. If you call it these things, you will be destined to be frustrated when you check the information a year or two later and it is completely different. Snapshot. I'm going to assume that most people who have joined the webinar have clicked on the website, but the intention is to keep it really quite simple. So you jump on and you can explore certain information. There's a lot of extra info there if people want, and links. The main thing though is to jump on and explore and type in your council or community name and you will find a snapshot. You can also jump in and see everyone that's there so far. The intention, as Imogen mentioned, is that we will have everyone in Australia before too long. You jump on, click on your council and voila, you can explore around. We have a bunch of frequently asked questions. If you have more, we will add to them as time goes on. There's a bunch of resources and detailed methodology. Everything is transparent. You can find out how we calculated all of the data. User guides, any more information, any questions, just jump on an email, hello@snapshotclimate.com.au, and we get back to you. Download a report. Here's some examples. Why am I going through these? I'll just go through these really quickly just to give you examples of how they can compare. So Onkaparinga in South Australia, 1.4 million tonnes. You can see there a lot of transport emissions and electricity. Most cities do have, or councils and communities, electricity does form the majority of emissions. WA, Perth, Coburn, a lot of gas. You'll see there's no ag in most of these ones until you start moving into regional and rural profiles where suddenly agriculture, for example, will start forming a big part of the profile. Download a report, it looks like this. Pay for a comparison report, it looks like this. And what you get here is a comparison of your municipality compared to others. There's a lot of data that underpins this information. So this, for example, is for Strathbogie, and the information and the data underneath has checked to see who Strathbogie's cohorts are. Who are the similar cities that we can compare emissions? And then you find that you get information like this. You do have to pay for this. It's under $500, and that money all goes into the ongoing maintenance of Snapshot, so we can make sure that we can continue creating these over the next couple of years. I'm just going to jump in and see if there is a question. I might have to come back to that. That's a specific one. I'm sorry, Michelle, but we'll come back to you. Any others, please jump into the question box and ask away. Okay, so how to use Snapshot. Having an emissions profile reduces emissions by exactly 0 tonnes. It is really just a starting point. It does nothing on its own. Apologies. Too late. I didn't actually swear. It's just much. So what is much more important is how you use it. And what we've done is we've got 4 or 5 ways that we have found that cities, councils, communities have started to use Snapshot, and we would recommend having a look and doing the same. The first thing is you target action areas. You get an understanding and an idea of where your emissions are. This is Brimbank. This is just picked out of nowhere, or the example is, but you'll see there, for example, that, let's have a look at this, guys, and feel free to jump in. Brimbank has 2.85% waste. If you're a community member in Brimbank, if you're working in the city of Brimbank and you're focusing 70 or 80% of your time in the community working on reducing waste emissions, it might be time to reassess and start looking at electricity and stationary energy, and particularly industrial emissions. This is not to say do not focus on waste, just so that's really clear, or hey, residential is only 14%, so let's not assist the community with solar. It just gives you an understanding of where you probably are best to target your intervention. Got a question that's come through, a specific one, but I might answer this one. I'll put it to you guys. Southern Grampians emissions have reduced considerably since 2005. How would we find out why that is?
So the main thing, a few things that are driving emissions over time is in the electricity sector, it's the state's emission factor. So in Southern Grampians, which is Victoria, the emission factor has dropped from around 1.4 to about 1.1 over the last 15 years or so. So that would be reducing your emissions in electricity by 20 or 30%. So that's an immediate one. And then it could be all sorts of things to do with what sort of crops people are growing, what kind of animals they're running on the land, but we can look at some of the specific details as well in different types of areas. I know Lex is shortly going to talk about an example of 3 different councils in New South Wales as well, and talk about why they're different. But these are the sorts of trends that you immediately start asking questions about.
So there's another question similarly around electricity emissions. To be honest, electricity emissions at a community scale are widely out of your control as a council, and Tracy, Bernie and Imogen, please jump in if you've got different thoughts. Decarbonising the grid is not something that you can do on your own. The grid is generally still quite carbon based, and so the reason it will be going down is because we have more renewable energy in the grid. When we're talking about electricity, There are certainly things that can be done, but generally it's those bigger picture things that are going to really reduce those emissions. Look at Bringback. They're not going to be able to reduce industrial, commercial and res on their own. The biggest thing that will probably reduce this would be if, for example, the emission factor went down even further. Like the state government in Victoria has a renewable energy target, you reduce the emissions factor by a tiny amount and that goes down significantly. Imogen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just on industrial emissions, there is an opportunity for council in particular to play a role with the industries in their council as a key stakeholder, because often, some councils have industry as a large proportion of their emissions, and there's usually only a few stakeholders involved. So if you can actually set up projects with those industries and demonstrate ways that they can decarbonise or electrify to renewables, you might get a really significant chunk of emissions knocked off with reasonably low effort. And the Beyond Zero Emissions Electrifying Industry report, which was released last year, gives great examples of how that can be done and how it's already cost effective for heaps of industries. So I think there's a really key role that councils can play there in facilitating groups getting together and talking about solutions.
There was another question about industrial emissions, and it's important for people to be aware that industrial emissions are not just from factories or manufacturing. It includes industrial processes. So that can be things like building a road, using concrete in pavements or other things. So that's capturing a number of things, not just factory and manufacturing emissions.
Just on concrete, that's another key BZE area of expertise.
Oh, we're going to get to that. That's okay. But we're going to move to communication. Snapshot is beautiful. We had a meeting yesterday with the Department of Primary Industries and Environment. I think that's what DPI stands for. We had the science team there who don't normally talk about beautiful data, but they were talking about how it looks amazing, which it does. Gone are those funny little Excel fuzzy charts and graphs. A lot of research and time went into making sure Snapshot was using the best principles around communicating data. It clearly illustrates the challenges and opportunities. They clearly communicate the community emissions profile. You can use it to communicate with councillors, finance teams, funding bodies, anyone else that's holding the purse strings, or to other departments of council, why budgets and resources should be allocated to certain areas and why you should be focusing your reduction on certain areas. You can use this to say, we can see here that industrial emissions are the big part. We need to start focusing on there and resourcing it properly. It's really good to have a solid start to discuss and justify your actions, both internally and externally with the wider community industry. It's a good way to start conversations or inform and educate and improve the literacy. There's a lot of information out there on communicating climate and science. So just as an example, the data that underpins Snapshot is actually now being used through the Monash Climate Communications Research Hub. Anyone that gets leader newspapers will see that you're starting to get charts like this, and you'll see that weather presenters are now also using this sort of data to explain climate and climate action. I highly recommend people jump out there and have a look at some of the resources that are around. Yale Climate Communications, for example, and WAGA's got an amazing communications climate change document. The Climate Council are probably better than anyone in Australia. Go and learn how to communicate. There's a lot out there. Snapshot provides the opportunity to collaborate. Map your stakeholders, talk to other people, find out who the larger emitting areas, organisations or sectors are. Is it the large industrial emitters, steel plants, oil refineries? Singling out the large emitters can also help normalise the emissions to demonstrate how well a council is doing. This is quite interesting to say if you're in Hobson's Bay or Wollongong, and you'll find that you've got a big chunk of your emissions that are essentially BlueScope and ExxonMobil. If you wanted to reduce your emissions in the community by 5-10%, the first thing to do would be to talk to them. This is not to say that don't do community solar and don't do those processes, but it does give you an understanding. This is the point that Paul brought up before. This is really interesting for the New South Wales profile, just recently released. So these are all regional and rural New South Wales towns. Gilgandra, Gunnedah and Griffith. Griffith posed a question, which was, why does everyone else have massive agriculture emissions and we've got nothing? There must be an issue with the tool. It turns out that it's just different ag practices within Griffith that make the difference. They don't have cattle. They've got mainly pigs and wheat, I believe, which are a lot less emissions intensive. And so if you're in Griffith, you might want to start looking not so much at the dairy and cattle industry, but other areas. Whereas if you're in Gilgandra and Gunnedah, there's a clear area there where you can start collaborating. I'm just going to jump to some of those questions. We're looking at emissions from waste. Is it the case from waste, or does it include the transport from the collection of waste? I think it's just the collection of waste. The transport will be under either transport emissions, or if you somehow were having the waste transported by train, it would come under electricity. And this is all luckily within the methodology documents. Air travel, if Matt's on the line, I might get him to quickly ask this. Someone has said 0 tonnes for domestic air travel, doesn't mention international air travel at all. This is from the Melbourne municipality of Knox. Possibly you don't have an airport?
Yeah, that would be why.
Air travel is quite challenging, and there are a few different methodologies that you can use. You could look at where planes are leaving and returning from, or a few different ways. And again, all of those are within the GPC methodology documents. Collaboration. If you've got a lot of industrial processes, rethinking cement, electrifying industry, there's a lot of information out there that you can use. But you've got Snapshot to get the ball rolling and start talking about it. Snapshots explain the scale of the challenge. You, as a local government or as community groups, have certain control over some emissions, but generally for a council, your emissions are 1% of the broader community. Snapshot explains that there's a lot that we need to do. And if you are communicating these challenges and you want to look at reducing emissions as quick as possible, we are in the critical decade and we have 10 years to basically get to 0 as soon as possible. It does help explain what's required within your patch. You can incorporate and join this with things like targets and carbon budgets. I know there's a bit of conjecture around there around having a carbon budget for a municipality, but along with Snapshot, I can give you an indication of what is required. It is challenging, but if we are in a climate crisis or climate emergency, this is what we need to do, and what we need to reduce pretty damn quickly. Okay, any other questions? Big emitters often dump thermal energy that can be exchanged with district energy solutions. Is that in the tool available in the Snapshot tool?
That information is about specific projects in specific locations, and that level of detail is not in these projects.
All right. We had a lot of people asking about whether it was checked, this data, and is it robust? It is robust. It is incorporating people that have taken these courses over a very long period of time. It involved working with these international organisations that at various times have checked and verified the data for international reporting. C40, for example, looked at the basic methodology for the Greater Melbourne project. And most importantly, recently, Sustainability Victoria and Renew were involved in the peer review process to develop Snapshot. And we probably should give a really big shout out to Damien and Taryn from Renew, Brendan, I think it is, from Little Sketches, and Lisa, Steve and Guy from Sustainability Victoria. So the data has been reviewed a lot. Here are the kind of data sources that are there. Again, we had quite a few people asking. international data sources around, certain coefficients, national ones and local ones. Ideally, we get as local data as possible, but what happens generally is we find that it's a mix, and it's all available. Jump onto Snapshot under it's either resources or about, and the methodology document is there, and you can see exactly what we've done. There's different types of data, tier 1, 2 or 3. Sorry for the slightly wordy slide here, but tier 1 data basically means you don't have access to local activity data, so it's national or state, and you've also got national and state emissions coefficients. Tier 2 means you've actually got the local activity data, which is great if you can get it, and it's compliant, which means it's got to be complete. And tier 3, which is very unusual in Australia, where you've also got local conversion factors or coefficients. Most of the data within Snapshot is tier 1, and you can jump on and have a look. It's in that report. It's all transparent. One important thing just to note, because people go straight to accuracy, and so many of the questions that are coming through here, which we're not going to get to individually because you're looking at your own profiles, and there's questions around accuracy. Just remember that accuracy should be matched to the requirements of the decision being made. It's only as valuable as the decision influences. So, tell me if this is inaccurate, the original data here. Let's say you spend $250,000 on some state-of-the-art data capturing thing, maybe for transport, and you realise that your commercial stationary energy was not responsible for 18.26, but 18.37. Is that inaccurate? That's not going to change anything that you do. So the data accuracy should be as valuable as it is that it's going to actually influence your decision-making processes. There's a question here around Hepburnshire and their carbon inventory or their profile through the ZNet process. Is this an inventory or a profile? Do you want to have a go at that one, Imogen, first, or should I give my response?
I think you know better than me.
It's a profile. Unless you can tell me when every single car is coming into the municipality and whether the trains are coming within Hepburn and then to Bendigo, there's a certain amount that is being modelled, and so I'm not sure how you can call that an inventory. However, as we get better data down the track, smart information, we know that essentially we can measure, theoretically, the cars going in and out of Hepburn or any municipality because there are phones and Google Maps in every car. It is possible to improve on it, and that is one of the things that we've been doing behind the scenes. There's a lot of third-party organisations, Centre for New Technology, Emerging Technologies in Vic and Google, and the intention is to talk to them, but it takes time. Working with distribution businesses, a lot of councils and communities, and I would just caution people on trying to get postcode level data from the likes of these guys, because what we find over the course of 10 years is the data is bullshit a lot of the time. And often distribution businesses will quietly tell you things like, don't use the data before 2016, we had some issues. People see postcode, people see decimal points, and they think it is somehow more accurate, but it is often not the case. Unless it is transparent and you actually know how it's been developed, you're not going to get the ticket approval from a compliance point of view. We've worked with cities in Western Australia where they provide information from Western Power or Horizon, and we compare it with the model data and think it's 30% out what's going on. You go back and ask the distribution business, they get back to you a month later and tell you that it's all okay. You keep pushing and they finally tell you that they had actually removed 15 or 20 odd of the big emitters for privacy reasons. But you don't know that when you're getting the data. So the process is to work with these guys, but probably do it at a sectoral level or a state level. There's no magic bullet here. It takes time. All right. Before I jump into the future and quickly check the time, I'm just going to see if there's some other questions here on a snapshot. If you want to use this data to communicate directly with residents on how they can change their behaviour to reduce their emissions, Snapshot does not seem very helpful. Is that right? It does not include food choices like red meat and air travel. Imogen.
Yeah, it doesn't go down to that level of detail, but I think you can use it as a tool to communicate with your residents and say, this is our patch and these are the emissions that we're responsible for. What do you guys want to do about it? What are the things that will work as our community, and what do you want to put your time and energy into? And start using that to build relationships and build projects and build community capacity. So no, it doesn't tell you explicitly what to do, but it's a really great starting point to have those conversations.
There are other processes which are picking up that information and running with it on certainly state-based levels in terms of what are the impact of food choices, you know, what happens when you recycle, when you don't recycle, and emissions. So this is not currently doing that.
The emissions profiles, if you were to add up every single snapshot in Australia, once they're all up there, they will equal Australia's emissions, and they will incorporate the emissions from meat, because there's a very clear guidelines on how you do that, and you look at the profiles of the likes of Tenterfield and Gilgandra and those ones. That's where your cattle and dairy emissions are. The other thing is that I think it does also help, and we've talked about this before in previous webinars, the way good old neoliberalism has us talking about these things as individuals, which is really important. But possibly one of the things that this shows you is that 22, 25 million Australians changing their behaviour is important, and we do need to do that to reduce emissions. Possibly though, talking to 6 or 7 state governments, 15 odd distribution businesses, and looking at where those larger emission sources are coming from, and that's when it becomes important to talk to people, organise, and get involved in the larger processes. For example, the best thing that you can do to reduce emissions is probably to close the Liddell power station. I can't do that, the councils can't do it on their own, and so they need to collaborate and work within the larger structure. Any counterpoints to that, guys? Please jump in. Great. All right. Over the next months and years, we are definitely going to look at improvements to data, including more data sources. We would love to be able to have basic plus profiles for every council around Australia, so that does include ag, forestry, land use, and industrial processes. We want to incorporate action. So this is a starting point. We have profiles, and so councils, communities know where their emissions are from. If you know you've got a certain amount of transport emissions and you are a local government, for example, local community group, what is your role to play in working with the community? Is it advocacy, education? Is it actually paying for things? Is it loans? Is it finance? Is it delivery? Ideally, we would love to go down the track of providing that sort of information and support, and that's one of the conversations that we're having. Collaboration, so working with other stakeholders, and we're very keen to get other organisations, levels of government and non-government organisations together. Reporting, as was touched on at the start, wouldn't it be awesome to reduce the burden of reporting for those cities, councils that are involved in reporting through GCOM or others, or a city power partnership with terms of community reporting? You just jump on a snapshot and click your button, and then it will report automatically. This is maybe a bit of a pipe dream. Maybe there are data people that can put APIs in there and it can be done quite quickly, but we would love to do that because it becomes easier to report. And finally, the incorporation of target setting for communities and broader municipalities. So, you know, how do you get to zero as soon as possible? Imogen, do you want to jump onto you've got some other thoughts there around the next phases and just bring them up, because there's a few extra ones there that we haven't covered.
Yeah, I guess so. For councils who are already engaged in this, I think this tool is a really great starting point to engage your community. And for communities whose council aren't engaged, it's a great tool for them to start passing in the council as well. I think probably one of the next steps is for you to bring your community together and start having conversations around, you know, these are our emissions profiles, what do we want to do about it? What sectors are most important to us? Where do we think we have the most influence and leverage to actually change things? What are the behaviour programs or you know, programs of interest to your community and your council, and start mapping those out in line with targets and other projects that you can do. So the real outcome for me will be if this actually builds efficacy and capacity in communities to drive change.
Question we had from Stephen regarding the City of Melbourne, who have got different snapshot data to what's in their previous reports. If you're from a community group or a council and you've got your own data and you want to include it instead of the data that's on Snapshot, email it through. It's quite easy we've got override functions, and so if you've got better data more up-to-date data, it is no problem at all to incorporate it in there. Bearing in mind the information here, I think, if we've got some City of Melbourne people on the line, we did get straight from the C40 Greater Melbourne project, but it's no problem at all to change that if you like. There's a question around the wording, and there's information on every snapshot about what type of council you are, small, large, regional, other. Someone said small high density doesn't represent us. These are correct compared to the national averages, but they might not be how you view yourself. So suburban metro council might feel low density in comparison to the city, but all that data comes from automatically the national database. How is consumption represented? I'm not sure what that means. A question on the methodology around agriculture. Ag's really challenging, but it's determined through ABARES, so that's the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics, I think, something like that. So they're agricultural commodities data, and then it's allocated to certain highly technical standards, SA2, ASGS, that only the data nerds out there know, and are overlaid by area to local government boundaries. Other questions that have come through. Someone wanted to know about gaining access to public land to plant trees and build ecosystems. So land use, which comes under that AFOUL, ag, forestry, land use and other areas. Is there a way that we can incorporate land use and public land planting to build ecosystems?
So land use is already incorporated. So some council areas, if you separate out agriculture and land use, often what you'll see is that land use is actually a negative on the emissions because trees are growing and land use is changing. Depending on where you are, obviously if there's a low land clearing, then that becomes an emission source. So we've grouped in the graphs agriculture and land use together so that it works in the circle. But in a lot of areas, we've separated those out, so you can actually see what the changes in afforestation does. In reality, at this level, at community profile level, there needs to be reasonably substantive changes to land use to show up on the community profile. So we're not talking about, 1,000 trees. If you put in 1 million trees and there's significant change in the land use, then that substantively impacts on the community profile.
It's a great question from Jenny here from South Australia, from Monca. At the moment, the comparison report would be from the pool of existing councils in Snapshot. How many is that again? And would there be enough councils to provide an adequate comparison for a peri-urban council? It's not all 500 councils yet, so I think there's probably about 250 there at the moment. The point of comparing to other councils, so what we've got there and what we showed in that example was cohorts. So it's looking at the characteristics that strongly influence emissions and the capacity to implement change, such as population, employment, socioeconomic factors, relative proportions of certain activity. And I think one of the important things there is traditionally councils have looked at sort of comparisons as a sort of a challenge or a competition, which isn't necessarily very helpful. So if you're comparing to other councils and local government bodies, the old school was, let's be competitive, let's rank who's number one, identify whether you're successful or otherwise, when a lot of it is out of your hands when it comes to strictly a data point of view, if you're lucky enough to have an airport, for example. What is much better is that you use that information to better understand your council and see who your real peers are. So if you're a peri-urban council, don't go and compare yourself with capital cities or small rural. And what that does is it looks at those that are more relevant, connect you then with organisations that are taking actions that are relevant to you. Ideally, Jenny, we will get, we certainly will get all of our councils around Australia in there. LGAQ, how is Snapshot being communicated to local government associations? Tim, good question. We've spoken to other states, and as we get out and launch Snapshot, we're getting some great feedback from them, and we're in initial discussions. The council can get their own profile, pay a consultant a lot of money, which is one of the reasons why we've sort of got together to develop this. because if this is a barrier to communities and councils, then we're not really doing our job. You could help, maybe we'll take it offline so we can try and get some resources so we can get Queensland up there as soon as possible. Is there a link that explains which emissions are included in industrial electricity? Seems to be a range from factories that are actually in the LGA to things like concrete used to build a road or a house, even though that is not manufactured within the Local Government Association. That is a little start. And then,
one thing that's useful to note is there are emissions when you're building the road on that site as well. But you're right, where there's a cement manufacturing location, that'll be where the emissions are within the profiles. But when you're building a road, there's emissions from the vehicles, there are emissions from the bitumen that's being laid down, and all of those will be counted within your emissions. There is detail on Snapshot of where the emissions come from, all those calculations, which breaks it down by the different areas, including industrial.
Awesome. Our council receives waste from surrounding councils. Are the waste emissions based on a per population factor or actual burial data? Burial data. Yeah, good question. Do you want to jump to that one?
I don't know.
So there are various ways that you can, the methodology within the GPC explains the various ways that you can treat emissions from waste. At the moment, we're generally using the scaling factors, and so it looks more at per population, but it's challenging because, for example, if you're in different cities and different states have got different ways that they process waste, and obviously, we know that in New South Wales, for example, there were cities that were trucking their waste up to Queensland. So is that fair that, the Queensland council take all the waste? So what we've ended up using is more of a scaling around population, but it's not just population. Amber, there's a bunch of other factors that are incorporated in there. But if you don't have a waste facility within your municipality, you will still have waste emissions. Multinationals need to report primary energy use and give insights on energy efficiency. Is that included in the snapshot? No, I don't think so.
Oh, well, it is including electricity and gas consumption from businesses within a particular municipality.
Cool. Thank you. But I guess there's nothing on the energy efficiencies of projects or actions or things like that. It's just everything that is happening is incorporated within the local profile. All right, we've got no time left. It's 12 o'clock. So we're going to have to wrap it up. They were fantastic questions, so thank you everyone for putting them up there, and feel free to keep them coming or email hello@snapshot in the email address that we provided at the end, and I'm sure it'll be in the follow-up email. Special thanks to Imogen Judd, Paul Brown, Tracy Armstrong, Bernie Cotter, and the other Ironbark crew on the line. Also to Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, State of Victoria, and probably should also mention to the New South Wales Councils, the Department of Primary Industries and Environment, have also helped fund a lot of New South Wales councils too. There's an organisation called Weekends who have been helping with technical support from the website, and Renew and ICLEI for not just the last 6 or 12 months, but the last 4 or 5 years really in the technical oversight, and the 100 odd councils working with BZE, City Power Partnership, ICLEI, and other organisations, and developing these over time too. And congrats to BZE and the Ironbark teams, and particularly Nikki Cole, Imogen, Matt Sullivan and Rachel Armstead, who have been working their backsides off in the last year or so to develop this. As mentioned at the start, we'll follow up with any unanswered questions with people over the next few days, and a recording will be available. We'll send out a notification email when it is there for you. Otherwise, we will catch you later. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.